My name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a BCBA. In today's video, we're going to discuss Unit 2 of the Ethics course. Now, Unit 2 is just a continuation of the started list from Unit 1. So it started off with discussing 1.06 and 1.07, respectively talking about multiple relationships and conflicts of interest and exploitative relationships. So things you want to avoid and how to address them as they arise. So sometimes parents will ask to like hang out or will ask if you can babysit, and it's the many things you can do to avoid that or at least respond to that when they occur. Unit 2 then goes on into a great deal into the 2nd and 5th and 10th sections of the ethics code. It's just going to be kind of a laundry list from here. Number 2.05 is the rights and prerogatives of clients. So basically, when you have clients who are older, they need to be aware of their rights. And so you can actually tell kids, essentially, who are like 13 to 15 to 18, who are then qualifying as adults, right? They can decline your service. There's nothing forcing them to actually maintain services. If they don't like it, if they don't want it, if they are feeling like it's not benefiting them, they can just say, no, we're not having session today. And your response is, okay, we're not having session today, because you are respecting their autonomy. They are a full-grown adult. And there was one article that I had learned about recently in my supervisor experience class, where the title was basically the right of people with disability diagnosis to overeat donuts and stay up till midnight, or something like really specific and oddly funny. But it's basically like, yes, we want to provide as much help as we need to help them and as much help as they perceive that they need, but also they have the freedom to do these things. Like, no one's perfect, so they have their own right and their own autonomy. So it's a big thing in ethics to make sure that we are addressing the fact that every client has rights, and we need to inform them of those rights and let them know that they can decline treatment. Now, if it's a child, like a 5 or 6 year old, that goes straight through their parents. My manager recently told me that we did take a case. She wrote a behavior plan after assessment, and the parents said, no, we don't want to do this. And my manager was basically like, okay, well, that's, like, would you like to try something else? Do you want me to rewrite something? And they said, no, we don't want our kid to cry. And everything you are saying is going to make him cry. So no. So she was like, okay, well, have a great day then. Like, that's totally fine. And they family actively and mutually agreed to just leave, because they were like, you know what, we decided ABA is not for us, and that is within their right. There's no pushing, there's no shoving on that end, because we are a tool. We are not like a dogma, So there's definitely something to be said about respecting the autonomy of clients. It moves on to 2.06, which is maintaining confidentiality. Once again, don't list any sort of details that would make people think that, oh, like you're describing that very well. Like, I know this family over here that this kid does this and this kid's name is this. Like, so you're not going to release names, schools that they go to, addresses, phone numbers, things like that, right? So you're maintaining confidentiality. 2.15 or 2.15 is interrupting or discontinuing services. So if you have taken up a lot of clients, or if you are have a client that has developed something that is beyond your scope of practice, so to speak, or there's just a mismatch of scheduling where now they can no longer see you or you can no longer see them due to conflicts of scheduling, there is an ethical way to stop services. So we need to follow that and make sure that we don't just say like, okay, doesn't work, okay, bye. We have to kind of disboard them and make sure that they or debrief them of their services, right? And make sure that they're okay with where they're at. And even if they're not, have them understand that there's just no practical way of continuing services if it is like a conflict of scheduling or something like that. So families, when they're first introduced and brought on to services, have this understanding of like, yes, services can stop at any time if scheduling does not work out well. So there's an ethical way of stopping services. The sections then go on to 8.04, which is media presentation and media-based sources. Basically saying if you're going to talk about ABA in general, like on YouTube or anything like that, that you maintain confidentiality of clients, caregivers, stakeholders, things of that nature. It goes into further detail of it, but not too much. They just focus on like, make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality throughout anything you mention within ABA. Unit 2 then goes on to discussing 9.02 of the code, which is compliance with BACB standards within supervision and coursework. So Unit 2 really wants to focus on behavior analysts as supervisors and the responsibility that behavior analysts have to the board. So the board, obviously controlling the Board of Ethics as well within BACB. So we do have an obligation to maintain ethics. That being said, the compliance is basically saying, know the code, know the sections, understand that these all exist, and be familiar with them at all times. One of the co-instructors did describe it as kind of like having a Bible. You always want to have it around, ready, steady. And so if someone has an ethical question, you can just pull it out, look through and look at it and say like, okay, this is what I know. This is what I interpret from it. Like I said, it's slightly subjective, right? And so this is what I think you should do. And if you feel like there's something unethical, you can send the issue to the board and they will try to address it. Beyond that, it goes to section 5.01, which is supervisory competence. There is actually an 8-hour training that once you become a BCBA, you have to take this training in order to provide supervision. Until you get that training, anytime you are supervising, you're not actually your supervising hours don't count, so to speak, towards any count. If an R.B.T needs supervision hours or someone who's studying to be a B.C.B.A needs hours, that won't count because you are not qualified yet because you have not taken the training. So make sure that you have the competence to do so and make sure you're familiar with the competence thereof. 5.02 discusses supervisory volume. So obviously don't take on like 50 people because you can't physically supervise 50 people. 5.03 discusses supervisory delegation, such as only delegating for things that you know your supervisees are capable of doing, right? So you wouldn't expect a supervisee to write up an entire program unless they're like a B.C.A.B.A or something like that. But even then, they would have to check everything through you. So manage expectations, essentially, right? So if you are saying like, hey, I need you to graph this, make sure that they know how to use the graphing program that you're giving them or that they have a graphing program. That's all included within delegation. It's not just, hey, this is ABA, this is what you need to do, go collect the data. It's, do you know how to use the iPad that we're using to collect data? Do you know how to charge it? Can you maintain this? Do you know how to write? Do you know how to use Microsoft Word to type up your report? That's all included within delegation. You need to make sure that if they don't know those things, that you are also training them too, because it's not like oh, well, go take a class or something like that, unless you feel as if that's absolutely necessary, but understand limitations of how to work with things inside ABA. So once again, not just programming, not just conceptual stuff, but actual physical tools and technologies that we use within ABA. 5.04 discusses designing effective supervision training. So this is addressing the supervisory contract that you have. There's 3 criteria for effective supervision. Number 1 is make sure that everything that you guys discuss is behavior analytic and content. Number 2 is effectively and ethically designed programs. So when you are having a meeting with someone, make sure that they are alone, so to speak, when you are discussing like client issues or anything like that. You don't want to be like in a busy coffee shop or anything discussing client details. So it's ethically designed and also effectively designed. You want to make sure that you're addressing things that they will actually do. One bad example I heard was one of my manager's supervisors. All he did was just assign articles. And while good, that wasn't relevant to what they were doing. So it's not effectively designed, right? So he'd just say, read this article and give me a synopsis and what you interpret from this data in 2 weeks. And there was no discussion on the current programs that they were working on with certain clients and how they could effectively change certain things if they needed to. You want to make sure you're being effective. The third criteria of design for effective supervision is it meets the task list requirements. So remember, the BACB has a task list that we are taking classes for, that we are learning day to day in the field, and it's listed out very specifically on what is expected of you to know. So you want to make sure that even within supervision, a lot of times at the end of like the supervision agenda, it will say what task list topics you covered, so that you know that you're covering all the topics over time. So you can look back through all of these agendas and be like, okay, on this day, we covered this, and this topic, and that covers that. So we went over it, and then you can see what things you need more or less help on. Beyond that, Unit 2 moves on to section 5.05 of the code, which is communication of supervision conditions, which is basically contracts. Make sure that you have a supervision contract with all your supervisors. There is one for group supervision and there is one for individual supervisors. So I have currently 2 supervision contracts with 2 different supervisors, and I'm probably going to make a third because one of my managers just recently became a BCBA, so I'm going to have to write one up with him. And it's basically to set expectation and limitation. If they are not my main supervisor, I'm not going to meet with them every month alone to figure things out, right? But with my assigned supervisor, I can ask her to meet with me a few times a month to go over things that I have in class. There was even an instance where I was really struggling with a concept and I said, please, for our next meeting, can we just focus on IOA? And she was like, yeah, so we spent the entire hour just doing that. I'm not gonna do that with any other supervisor except for my designated one, but I'm still gonna have contracts with all of them. Limits and expectations, right? The next section is 5.06, which discusses providing feedback to supervisees. Yes, this is an ethical expectation. If you do not provide feedback, you are not supervising. So it is assigned to you, if you are a supervisor, that you must create a system and also provide feedback to all your supervisees. Whether or not you can do so effectively is kind of up to you and your supervisee. There are different ways you can evaluate this though, right? You can see this through your own behavior. You can see this through your supervisee behavior. And if you guys have clients together, which hopefully you do, you can see it through the client behavior. Is the client making progress? Are there things changing within the client's home that are reflective of what the supervisee has discussed and is on the topic of what you guys have met up about? Is the supervisee increasing or changing their own criteria of how they're able to continue? So I was struggling with something, so I asked for help and she was like, great, that was really good. I'm glad you asked for feedback on that because I never had a problem with that topic. So I would never have thought to try and teach you. But because you reached out, that's really good. So that was her feedback, right? She encouraged me. She reinforced my behavior of asking for help on a specific topic. Those are the types of behaviors that you can kind of evaluate how effective your supervision is. I felt comfortable enough to say, hey, I know we don't do this in our main field, but because I'm doing this in class, I really want to get a lot of your input for this. And she was like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. I can do that. So the next section talks about the behavior analyst responsibility to the BACB specifically. So section 10 of the ethics code talks everything about the relationship between behavior analysts of the world and the board. So 10.01 is accurate info provided to the BACB. So your name, your phone number, your email address, your certification, and everything like that. That's all listed on there for them to have in case they need to contact you for any reason. If there's been some sort of ethical violation put against you or anything like that, they need to be able to contact you, and vice versa. They need to be able to provide your specific certification number, right? And it has to be listed and available at all times. 10.03 is confidentiality and BACB intellectual property, basically copyright. I can't take anything of theirs. That's why I don't use their logo for anything. I cannot take anything from them and say oh, look at what I wrote, right? It's copyright. 10.04 is examination honesty and irregularities. The BACB is very specific about how they run the examination to become a BCBA. You cannot share any information about the exam. This also goes for the R.B.T. exam. You can't do any sort of oh, well, I remember question 13 was this. The closest I've ever done when I'm discussing the exam is I give a very general example that was not at all on the test to describe the difficulty when people say oh, was the exam really difficult to become an R.B.T.? I'm like, well, it's not difficult, but it does make you think a lot. What is the best fruit to eat? Apples, bananas, or cherries, right? And it's just kind of whoa, all those answers seem the same, but there's actually very subtle differences among them in the R.B.T. test. That be as it may, it's because it also is copyrighted as well. So make sure that you are being honest, make sure that you have integrity. If there's ever a website that says oh, we have sample questions from the BCBA test, that's a huge red flag and you need to actually report that immediately, because then if that information leaks too much, they literally have to revamp the entire test, and it may affect who graduates because they may have to take a whole slew of people and say, sorry, you need to take the exam again because we don't know if this was actually on the world. We don't know if you guys got practice on this exam or not. That's why that's a huge ethical issue. The last section that they discuss is 10.07, which is discouraging misrepresentation by non-certified individuals of ABA. So basically, if someone comes around and is like a speech therapist and they're just like, oh no, like ABA is super abusive, I wouldn't suggest it because of this, this, and this, it is my responsibility, should I become a BCBA or when I become a BCBA, to actually stand up and say like, oh, you know, like there's a lot of scientific evidence that this is effective. There has been abuse in the past, and I will admit to that because that's totally true, but it doesn't negate any of the actual evidence within this growing field that this is effective, this is effective, this is effective. I'm just trying to implement like a token economy. I'm not gonna like beat a child. It's very specific to making sure that people who are not within our field have a decent understanding of ABA, because it does have a bit of a stained reputation, so to speak. And so they definitely want to try and fight that. That's all of Unit 2. I'm sorry that it comes across as so dry. I think that's the reason why they made this class only 3 sections, and they really just covered the basic, like, this is what we really want you to know things, because realistically, they want you to know the whole book, right, from cover to cover. But they understand it is really dry, even though it's really subjective, and I think it's because it's so subjective, it feels very dry. But I will see you in the next video then.